So thermals, in areas with terrain though, thermals are definitely exaggerated. So like the way I look at it is the bigger the mountain or the hill, the more exaggerated thermals can play a role in that. And also the more that it would take the wind to override those thermals. And I'll get into a little bit of like, as far as like what wind speeds, what wind speeds will override thermals and going through those different things. But the very basic part of it to start is like a good rule of thumb is like, as the sun's heating up, thermals are going up. As the sun goes down and the Earth's surface is getting cooler, then the thermals start to fall. But that is very much a rule of thumb. I hear it all the time of like, hunt high in the morning, hunt low in the evening, but that doesn't necessarily work at a lot of places, and especially you get on different slope aspects. So if you look at what slopes get the most sun typically throughout the day, south and easterly facing slopes. So maybe you might get a rising thermal earlier in those places, and I'll show you a tool to be able to help predict that a little bit. But then there'll be other places where you're on a west slope or a north slope, you might have downward thermal pull till noon, sometimes even all day if you have some thermal cover there with hemlocks or pine thickets or anything. So here's just an example that I have here of just showing predominant wind, thermals, uphill, downhill. So a lot of times when I'm looking at a map, I'll kind of go through and look at it from like a wind mapping perspective of like trying to see how I think the wind is going to flow through.
That shows you how confusing it
yeah, and that's what there's a purpose for showing like how this just looks like. What the heck? How do you could be going up, could be going down, all through these things, and that's the way it is. And unfortunately, and carrying milkweed is definitely a friend to be able to pull it. But so I'm just going to give you some situations here because, and again, this is a very popular topic because it's really difficult to be able to figure out. But here's some things like that I've found. Sunny areas will be warmer than shaded areas, which causes upward thermals. Cloud cover and storms rolling in can cause downward thermals. I see it all the time out west hunting mule deer, elk and stuff. You see the clouds come in a storm. It's like, hopefully you're not trying to stalk in from above a buck because everything's going to change and go down to them. Areas around running water are typically cooler, causing those thermals to pull down or pull in the direction of the water. And that really depends on the water depth, the width of the stream, the flow rate, etc. I don't sit there and try to be like, oh, well, that's a 7-foot stream, so this is good. Just pulling out milkweed to test it is a really good way of being able to look at that. Stagnant water, such as like beaver ponds, will stay warmer than the surrounding air when you have like frosty mornings. Love hunting low in around beaver ponds on frosty mornings. You sit on the head end of that, the thermals are coming down with that water, it hits that beaver pond and just rises, which makes it almost feel like you're in a bulletproof setup during those time frames. Heavy thermal cover areas, hemlocks, pine trees, hold heat when it's cold and then stay cooler when it's warmer outside. So a lot of times during earlier parts of the season, I'll see areas on west slopes, north slopes that are hemlock covered that will never have an upward thermal draft all throughout the day. It's always pulling down. But in the wintertime, that's almost reversed because it's acting as a blanket and it's heating everything underneath there and being able to have more of an upward pull there. Openings in the timber will get more sunlight, creating an upward thermals in calm conditions. Anybody that was in my group yesterday, we came down through those hemlocks coming down to the thermal hub, and there was one spot where we found all those good scrapes where the sunlight was coming through there. That's when I was like, man, this could be tough to hunt because I bet it's doing some swirling there because you have that sunlight coming through. It's a little warmer there. You could see it where it would just potentially have an issue with swirling.
It was that marker flag there. It was constantly changing. They had that little pink flag. It was going this way. It was going this way. It was going this way. It was like kind of going up and going down. Yeah. The whole time we were there, it was pretty neat watching it.
Yeah, it was. Trees, large rocks, and other obstructions can influence those air currents. So here's the example I was telling you about. You got, say the water's coming down and it hits that beaver pond and just goes like straight up, like just straight up in the air. And that was something I learned from you, Dad, a lot with even like hunting openings. It doesn't even have to be beaver ponds, but those openings in the bottoms.
And the hemlocks.
And the hemlocks, openings within the hemlocks.
Yeah, we talked about that yesterday in my group. It was one of the first scrapes we came on.
Yeah.
And how, possible setups. And mine was across, there was an opening there to where, you get a frosty morning, clear frosty morning. As soon as that, it starts warming up, it's going to be like a vacuum going straight up through there.
And that first, when it breaks, the sun hits those spots. I think it's first, yeah.
Yeah.
Even touch on the rocks. You have a rock face, they're going to maintain heat well into the evening and in the morning, so it can definitely affect what's going to happen with the thermals and the wind.
All right, so here's some factors here. It's like wind and thermals. Who's going to win that one as far as like battling out? You look at the weather conditions, and you got a 12-mile-per-hour wind coming through. It's like, do I got to worry about thermals? What's that going to mean? So the more elevation, the stronger the thermals will have an effect. And also the higher the wind speed, the more that wind will play a significant role. So like in smaller hill country, think 200, 400 feet, anything over 7 miles per hour, I start to think that it might be a little bit difficult to rely on that thermal pull and smaller stuff. You get to 400 to 1,000 foot elevation. Now anything, it seems like it takes about 10 to 12 miles per hour to have a real effect on it. And at 1,000 feet and over, 15 miles per hour or over to really be able to override that. But when you start getting up and you start getting those 20 mile per hour days, you won't catch me hunting in a bottom because it's real. I mean, I'd like to be because up top super windy, but it just creates so much swirling because that wind's just coming, rolling off, running down off this hill, hitting this one, bouncing, just thinking of it kind of like a pinball as everything's just swirling around and causing issues in there. So those vegetation and terrain features will play a big role in that. A conifer covered hillside may block a lot of that wind and create, a blanket from the sun, causing that downward thermal pull most of the season. And then, like I said, in late season, it can act as a blanket, having that, causing those thermals to rise. So there's a couple different ways that I try to go through and predict what the wind and thermals are going to be doing in an area before going through there. And this is definitely not a foolproof way by any means, but I'll look at the average historical wind speeds in Spartan Forge. We went over that a little bit yesterday, but inside the Intel tab, you can go in and kind of look to see what those average wind speeds will be doing. And you can see like the color coded blocks there telling you how much it is. And then there's a scale there that shows what the percentage of that would be. And then also looking at the map with just the topo layer or having LiDAR turned onto it and go through and see what might be affected with some of that wind. So then when you switch to the hybrid layer, you can look at some of the different vegetation types, conifer trees, ponds, running water, openings, etc. But really the best way to learn an area is just to take milkweed in there while you're there, throwing it up. And when you see what it's doing, pull out your phone and go into the journaling feature. When you go into journaling feature in Spartan Forge, it automatically has your GPS location there, the date and time that you're there, so it has that data. Because if you do it and it's 80 degrees in the summertime, well, those conditions are definitely going to be different once it comes November. Hopefully you have a nice cold morning then. But
Can you expand on that a little bit about the purpose of wind mapping spots, so make sure guys fully understand what you're talking about?
Yeah, so let me see if I have it on the next slide. So like I'll go through here, and if I'm looking at this terrain here and coming through, it's like, okay, we've got a west wind here. What are some things that could impact that as it's coming across? So we've got these valleys, we've got these drainages, we've got a high spot here that could cause it to hit and come down this direction and be able to move it. So when I look at this map, it's just kind of getting an idea of like what could impact it. For example, like you're coming up and you find a good spot, it's like, I don't know, right up in here, and it's like, what would an actual west wind do there? Well, it might hit some of that hill and actually cause it to come back around versus having a direct west wind that's there. Okay, so when you go in, you can look at, we're just gonna put 9 o'clock in the morning, 4 October. You can look at the land and see where the sun is actually hitting the hillsides at different times and hours throughout the day. At 9 o'clock in the morning in October, you can see these west slopes are still having shade. The sun's not hitting those yet, which can create a downward thermal pull later into the morning. Let's see, as you get through like, let's see, even, 10:30. Now, there's only a few spots that aren't getting hit on this particular hillside here, where all those big signpost rubs that we found yesterday, right above that, that's still a spot that's getting shade. But the one thing that this doesn't account for, that when you look at it, is you go back to your satellite layer, is the actual vegetation type. So when you look in here and you see all these hemlocks that are coming down through it, now that can add a different, even though the sun's hitting those hemlocks, it's still creating shade in there. So it might take longer for that to heat up. And just because the sun's hitting a place for a period of time doesn't mean those thermals just change like that. It takes a little bit of time for that to actually heat up the ground and the mountain there.
And one thing I learned with like wind and thermals, if you have like what we're looking at, okay, so you have like maybe your west slope might be shaded or whatever. Maybe you have, looking at that, maybe you have a wind coming out of the east, and like for every action, there's a reaction. So if you have like the wind hitting an east-facing slope, and as it's going across, hitting that east, and almost the thermals also are enhanced with that wind on the west facing. It's almost like a vacuum. It sucks it down, like it hits the east, or the coming from the east, the opposite hillside facing the west. It almost sucks it down that even more, But it's like sometimes I think about like every action as a reaction that might be just the wind hitting a hill and causing like a vacuum down the opposite side. You know what I mean?
Yep.
It's just crazy stuff. Like all them arrows you had, Beau, it's not all like black and white. Even though you wind map, you got humidity and precipitation and cloud cover and changing wind speeds and direction. Everything is not. I mean, wind mapping helps, but it's you can have it wind mapped and go in there, and then you'll drop your milkweed. You think it's going to go this way because you wind mapped it, and here it'll go that way.
Temperature plays a big part.
And temperature,
if it's
yeah.
cold during the day, same temperature at night, the thermal pull will be less drastic. But if you get really hot during the day and really cold that last hour, it can really affect how the thermals move. So you got a cold front, thermal pull might not be as aggressive. But early season, you might be get away with stuff because that last hour light, it's going to pull your scent. So you might be able to get a little more aggressive in the early October versus when you have a steady temperature.
Yeah, where you can see like how just setting up next to that stream or like those little ditches like that can cause such a difference in it. I mean, even when we were down in this thermal hub here yesterday, it's like you could see it. Like when you go over by the water, you drop that milkweed and just starts funneling down through there, versus it could be, you'd watch the ribbon that's out there by the scrape and it's moving all these different directions and going back and forth. Now yesterday's conditions, the wind speeds were a little bit high to having some big gusts to be down in there, and at the same time though, one thing that, especially when it comes to pre-rut and the rut, you're gonna have swirling conditions sometimes, and if it's up to me, like I'm just gonna chance it. Mason, I know we talk about it all the time as far as like just sometimes like it's the right spot, it's the right time of year, sometimes just going for it because you don't know exactly what direction they're coming from, especially when you get to rut-based setups.
Especially a spot like that too, Will, where it wasn't a spot that I felt like deer just hung out in all day. You're catching deer that are just passing through to check that spot. So you might only have to have the wind right in your favor for 30 seconds to pull it off.
Yeah, a lot of luck involved sometimes in mountains with the wind.
Or if you're Greg sitting on a buck bed,
You have to be.
you got to be dialed.
That's one thing I'm hunting out here. The wind's constantly changing, and I've told the story a few times. But the first evening I hunted with Johnny, he told me to go on this draw, and I'm pulling out milkweed, and these does are coming up, and it's going this way, and it just goes right to them. Like, man, they're gonna bust. They just sat motionless for like 5 minutes, and the wind shifted, went back to feed, and kind of went on to me, it was just weird because I'm used to, if any type of scent, Jersey, those does are gone. But they just froze. And just when the wind shifted, they felt comfortable and they kept moving on. And I'm like, to me, it was like, that's just so weird, you know?
Yeah.
But it's like, because it's constantly moving up here, they can't always be running in fear. So they just learn to kind of deal with some strange odors because they don't know exactly where it's coming from. They're not going to run, they could be running to danger.
And it's like, you think about it, you're walking ahead, especially if they have a visual with the wind coming directly in their face, is not as much of an advantage as it would be across. Now, the other thing is, like, you know, if the deer always moved with the wind, you know, perfectly in their face, I think a guy on the podcast said it's the funniest, best way. He's like, well, then all our deer would be in Canada. He's like, they just keep, because they gotta be able to move in a direction. Next thing to get into a little bit is choosing a setup, which we're talking about that as we're working through, but just to give you some kind of foundational pieces with that. So looking at like a setup like this is another example of seeing like how the wind and the thermals are gonna be able to interact with an area. So this was an actual example from the property we used to do the scouting camp at. Some buck bedding out in the point, some doe bedding kind of in this draw, and then a stand location that was up towards the end of this draw. And this is looking at it from a rut type setup where you have travel that's going this way, you have this saddle here coming through. Thinking of those daytime thermals coming up, you're like, all right, that's more of a spot you're thinking of. Not really first thing in the morning. Yeah, anything can happen, it could come through, but more of like those travel areas of a rut funnel, wanting to take advantage of those uphill thermals. So I want to set up above the trail in most of those situations so that I'm taking advantage of it. And it's like, okay, what do you do for the first hour or so when those thermals are coming down? Either sleep in a little bit, hunt my way in as it's getting daylight, sneaking through to get in there and get up, or you just have a bad wind for, you know, an hour until it changes and not anticipating anything's there. This setup, if I knew doe bedding was that close, I'd probably wait until those thermals had switched to get up in that tree, because I don't want to be, you know, wafting that scent down in there to them. So that's just an example of like finding sign and then going back and trying to read the map of like, all right, what time of the year am I going to be hunting this? What is kind of my game plan, and what do I anticipate for deer movement? And that's how I look at that when I'm thinking like above the trail, below the trail sort of setups.
Hey guys, thanks so much for listening. If you enjoyed this conversation, share it with your buddies. Leave us a rating, a review, and subscribe. If you want to check out more content like this, there's plenty in the links below. We truly appreciate having you guys along with us.